Committee. Before we get into the day's agenda, I'll ask my colleagues to introduce themselves in district number order.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kevin Flynn, Southwest Denver, District 2.
Good morning, Jamie Torres, District 3.
Good morning, Amanda Sawyer, District 5.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Jolon Clark, District 7.
Candy Cedevaca, District 9.
Yay, Candy Cedevaca.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Good morning, Stacey Gilmore, District 11.
Yes, I will,
Good
Katrina.
morning, Mr. Chair. Deborah Ortega, City Council at Large.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Today we have one presentation with Dr. Tracy L. Kesey, who is co-founder of the Center for Policing Equity. I see Dr. Kesey has just arrived on screen. In addition to founder of the Center for Policing Equity, Dr. Kesey is Senior Vice President of Justice Initiatives. She served previously as the first Deputy Commissioner of Equity Inclusion for the New York City Police Department, also served that agency as the Deputy Commissioner of Training. Dr. Kesey is a retired 25-year veteran of the Denver Police Department, including a proud stint as commander of District 3. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science from Metro, academic certifications in Public Policy and Public Administration, and a Master's of Arts in Criminal Justice from University of Colorado, Denver. She has also earned a PhD in Intercultural Communications from DU and a Diversity and Inclusion Certificate from Cornell University in New York State. She's also a graduate of the 203rd session of the FBI National Academy at Quantico, Virginia. Dr. Kesey, we look forward to your thoughts on policing equity in the 21st century.
Forward to seeing if y'all listen.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. And I also have to remind you, I was also the commander of District 5. I have to give a shout out. I cannot let that go. So.
Absolutely. Thank you for the correction, Doctor.
Oh, no worries, no worries. First of all, thank you again, and I appreciate the time to have this conversation because that's really what it is. And I want to make sure that I leave some time for your questions, your comments. And I wanted to be able to get a better perspective of where the city is in this moment of time and what you're doing and how you're thinking about moving forward. So I want to make sure that I leave time for that. I received several questions prior to the meeting, and I'm going to start with those, and then I'm going to fill in from there. But I want to start with probably a little bit of grounding. I think we all are very much in the middle and aware of what's going on around us. And I say that because
no, I don't think you are.
Oftentimes I've been wrong when I made that statement. And one of the things that has to happen in this moment in
They're
time,
paying
and as
attention, I wouldn't be
uncomfortable
here.
it is for a lot of people,
My
is
kids.
you really have to begin to get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because this moment is not going to pass fast or in a quick way or get through it. And we are really going to have to stop and begin to understand what it is that, one, what we're trying to solve for, and two, how do we make sure all of the voices that we need to make decisions are incorporated? And so
it won't happen when they're getting shot in the face with pepper
most
balls,
cities right now, and
like they are
Georgia,
downtown
a lot
right
of
now.
Cities throughout the country, most cities and counties
To take in an
are
ambulance.
struggling in this moment. And it's not a, sort of an admonishment to that, but it does highlight that there are things or gaps here that folks really need to think about as they move forward. And I noticed my apologies for my picture sort of going shady. I often tell folks I'm not in witness protection. I'm in San Diego with my grandchildren. So that's what that is. And the sun will come up in a second and you'll be able to see me again. But I want to just sort of highlight a few things about this moment. We have a country that is grieving.
Yep.
They're grieving on very many different levels, whether it be the police violence, the homicide of George Floyd. We have now another shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. We also have this unfortunate sort of coalition of events with the pandemic, high rates of unemployment, certainly around how do we do this work and try to account for all the other social structures and social things that are colliding all at once. And so this is a very difficult process to do and to think through. And what I also like to do is manage folks' expectations. A lot of times we want to rush through or try to figure out what the resolution is for those. And we didn't get to this space overnight, and it's going to take some time to get through it and to create what the community, again, community-centered, community-driven, what the community believes they need in the realm of public safety. And when we talk about public safety, we cannot omit all those things that intersect with public safety as well. Over the last 3 months, a lot of things, again, have fallen on top of police officers, policing in general, to lift up and resolve. And that is a problem. And so we cannot look to one group of people to fix just an enormous systematic failure in the issues of race and policing, ethnicity, equity, all of those things. That burden cannot lay at the feet of one, sort of group of people. So we really need to be mindful of that. And I think that some of that is missing as well, that we are asking one sort of entity to really resolve long historical issues. And so with that, I'm just going to highlight probably a few things, and then I want to open it up for questions. But I want to start with the questions that were sent to me. And the first one is surrounding the issue of defunding, abolishment of police, and how might policing change in that moment. The answer, and if you ask this of any one of my colleagues who do this work, the answer is we don't know. We don't know. And the reason why we don't know is because we don't know what we're solving for yet. Part of this conversation that we're having across the country is, what are the efficiencies that need to happen in policing or in criminal justice? Who has to own whatever changes are being proposed? How will that get funded? Who are those folks? And so the one thing that we don't know is that we don't know what the impact. I think we can guess. We don't have a correlation right now whether if you take away all the police, crime is going to rise, but you have to answer to violent crime. That's the other thing. You have to remember that you have folks that are still suffering, that are still victims. And so you can't sort of hold while you try to figure out what the new way or the end goal is going to be, because the life moves on, and that's just a reality. So one of the things that might change, I would say, and offer up, because it's going to look different in different communities. It just will. This is not about what's working in Seattle. Do we bring it to Denver? You have to really focus on the neighborhoods and the communities of Denver and what those needs are. And so what we are seeing across the country is that we know there's a lot of discussion around public safety versus policing. Yep. And that there's some type of entity, or whether we, redo the current police department to make that change. But there has to be some entity that really deals with public safety on a larger scale, not just violent crime, not just reports and then mental health issues and things like that, but really taking a good look at what the demand is on policing. What's the ask? And you can do that by looking through 911 and 311 to sort of get that first level blush of what's the demand on the police right now, so you can understand it. We know that if we defund the police, again, what does that mean? That definition itself means very many different things to different people. So the thing that always has to happen in this process and this work, and currently happening in this work, is there's got to be common language that everyone is using, and a common understanding of what we mean by defunding, what we mean by abolishment. Yep. And folks will tell you what they mean if you ask the question.
If you listen.
And so there has to be some determination.
We've told you, City Council.
Probably more of a collaborative agreement and understanding about what it is and what we're going for.
But sure, let's
you have to
workshop
manage
it.
the fact that you know that you're not going to make everybody happy. And I think you all are elected officials and you know that. But you really have to think through,
we're not asking
what
for happy,
are we talking about here, and what are we asking
less death of
entities
black
to do,
people,
and what are we asking our communities to do as well? Because a lot of this now is falling to communities who typically are not resourced to begin to answer those questions, and I'll go into that a little bit more as well. So in the era of defunding, it's going to look different. What that specifically will be, we don't know. We can guess. We know that if you pull resources from one place, someone has to make up whatever that it was that they were doing or not. those decisions have to be made. And when we always talk about defunding or anything that has to do with budgets, you also have to recognize a lot of community members don't understand how budgets are put together. There are large assumptions that if you defund the police, if you take money from police, if you don't hire, if you divert those funds, that they are going to show up in the community. And how quickly will they show up, and where will they show up? And so you really have to begin to lay a foundation of educating the community about governance processes. Some folks pay attention a lot. Some people, follow the council meetings and weigh in and speak up. Others don't. Others don't have that orientation. And so the responsibility of giving folks the grounding and what, how the systems work. What does this mean when we don't give someone money? What happens when we take money from one line and put it to another? But right now there needs to be a conversation in this defunding, abolitionist, or however you want to put it, efficiency movement. How does that function, and what does it look like? What may it look like? So you have to really begin to provide that foundational piece for community to understand. But again, I'm going to go back to this a couple times. We don't know what it looks like. We can guess. And so we have to be very careful as we plan through the importance of having all parties at the table, people who are working in that system, people who you might be thinking about moving things over to, also have to be a part of that conversation. So there's going to have to be a wide sort of coordination around this space, and I'll get to that a little bit later. I'm going to stop there to see if there's any questions around this defunding and how police might change.
Dr. Kesey, I'm not seeing any hands up right now. There goes the first one. First, I'll welcome Councilwoman Sawyer, Councilwoman Kinich, and Councilwoman Sandoval to our virtual table. Councilwoman Sawyer, go ahead, ask your question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
I'd like to point out that Amanda Sandoval, in response to a protest going to her home, threatened a child.
This is fantastic. This is
with
such an important conversation.
a Latino biker gang, and bragged about it in a paper.
A number of classes on community policing and doing a lot of
not equitable
reading into community policing to try and educate myself on what this looks like and how we do this and how to address the needs in one of my communities, East Colfax, which is, as you know from working in the city, the hardest hit community. This summer in particular, we have had just a dramatic uptick, particularly in homicides and in violent crime. It's incredibly sad. It's really dangerous. And so trying to support my community and figure out what I can do to help not only address and support the violent crime, but also the root causes of that violent crime. And in my research, what I have found is that the most successful models of community policing are the ones where we have beat cops who are walking the beat, who are walking the precincts, who are really on the ground with a presence pretty regularly, stopping in at stores and who are really on the ground, walking, biking, whatever, driving, whatever you want to call it. So 2 questions with that. Number 1, is that true? Have you found that to be the case? Can you validate for me maybe whether what I am finding in my research is correct? And also, if that
I'd like to be
true,
really clear, guys.
The other thing that I have found
research
is that
and Google
requires
search, not the
more
same
money
thing.
and more police, not less staffing. And so then how do we address that tension when we're looking at this conversation? And how do we support a community who is asking for help when what I'm finding is that the help that they need is not the help that they want.
No.
And that didn't come out right.
No, it didn't. No, it didn't.
How do we address
That was
that?
bad,
I would just
bad.
love your advice and thoughts
Woo!
on how to bridge this gap. And thanks so much.
You're welcome, and thank you for the questions. And I would
Jesus Christ.
before we talk about what can we validate, you should know, and I think you do know this, right? So communities are very different. And even in the era of community policing, how you define community matters.
Yes.
Who's defining that matters. And we know that, probably up on East Colfax, you've got probably a great mix of community, a wide range of diverse folks that are living up there now. And part of that sort of trying to explore what's next, you really have to bring the community together and engage them in certain ways, right? So it's not just, of course, Zoom, but you have some folks who don't want to show up in this space. You have others who will do a survey and send things to you so you can get a full understanding of what the ask and what the needs are. And that's something that the community is really going to have to sit down and figure out.
When a community sends you a survey like Candy Tabaka did, you should read it.
Validating whether it's true or not is sort of mixed in with your original sort of statement, and that is the underlying issues in the community and policing that make it problematic.
That's right.
So it may feel good in one community to have neighborhood policing look like that, and that may work, but it also requires a level of trust and an experience with police officers that doesn't feel as if they are showing up and occupying a space and not really being a part of the community. Again, these models work differently depending on where those models are being, placed or tried. I would say that what you want to think about is, are there other forms of community policing, right? So it's not just about beat cops. We know cops cost money. I'm not saying that's you should or shouldn't. But what you also want to make sure is that you're really engaging and using those resources on the ground that exist in communities already that may be able to help you do some of the things you're trying to get after.
Like the militias that they're letting run rampant in Kenosha, Wisconsin right now.
Folks who do that work are the least resource people. And so you really want to do a real good assessment of the neighborhood to see what's out there. What is already active, where maybe that's where we put the money to see if we can get that support built. But when you're talking about folks' safety and how they feel safe and whether or not they feel safe, that's a longer conversation. Well, you certainly don't let things go where people can't feel like they can walk around.
That's right.
That's different. That's different than community policing. And so what you really want to be able to do is, my suggestion is to start with, you're already having conversations, to broaden those conversations, because you're going to get a lot of input. And you're going to have to help sort of guide that input and provide them some options. I like the fact that you're doing your research, you should. But you should also provide them options of things that may not exist. You may create something different for that neighborhood that has elements of community policing, but looks very different and addresses their needs. So, as much as a social scientist say, as much as I love the science, don't get mired in the science.
Correct.
Right? There is a lived experience that has to be factored into what you're trying to do. And so you need to get that. Get as much information as you can. And then I would suggest you present those models and see what come up, how they feel. Is this good? Is this bad? And usually in those conversations, you're going to hear about other needs that really have nothing to do with policing at all.
Yep.
And so you want to make sure that you're accounting for those as well. But when you're trying to figure out what's the best way to do that, what you want to make sure is that you leave space to measure whether or not it's working and having the impact that you would like it to have. And if not, be prepared to do something different. Don't be afraid to say, this is not working. Let's try something else. Or let's see, can we make adjustments here? Because typically when we try to put programs in place to do this, we really go all in and we don't want to move. When we go, we say, okay, we've really spent a lot of time getting ready. Let's get this in here. And then when we figure out it's not working, we're reluctant because, it may make a statement about we made a mistake or it was wrong or it was the wrong approach. And that's okay. That's absolutely okay. So I just want you to think of it that way. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's what I offer.
Love it.
No, I think that's fantastic. Some of the things we've been looking at are things like, lighting, right? And trying to work with the infrastructure side of things to do more safety on kind of the infrastructure side.
Lighting is a big deal.
The root causes like hunger, to get more, work with our community providers to shore up the food services that are out there to do that kind of thing, and work with some of our other community service providers to provide the financial services that are needed out there and things like that. But I was asking, I guess, specifically about the the safety side of things. We have a situation where people are breaking their leases and leaving our affordable housing providers because they are afraid for their families. We have a situation where employees are quitting and leaving because they're afraid to walk to their cars at night. Those kinds of things are starting to happen in that neighborhood, and it's not okay, right? And so that is, I think, the difference is we are of course looking at those root causes and partnering with community service providers for those things. But I guess I am asking about the specific safety. People are afraid to walk around at night in this neighborhood that based on the things that are happening this summer, kind of thing. So anyway, thank you so much.
Safety is very personal. Absolutely, safety is very personal, right? Yeah. And so I hear you. So, and we can have a conversation offline if you like as well.
No, I will absolutely reach out. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next up, I've got Councilwoman Torres and then Councilwoman Ortega.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello, Dr. Kesey. My question is about, I was reading recently the Vox article that you did that focused on how officers are trained and what they end up spending most of their time doing when they're out on the street. And it was compelling, this kind of narrative of they are trained for kind of the warrior role for kind of response to the violent crime piece, but the vast majority of their time is spent responding like social workers to a community. And so I'm wondering, in some of the conversations around defunding, abolishing, kind of transforming policing in general, if there are ways that communities have found, or if it's even possible to train for both of those, or to kind of modify that paradigm differently with the same individual who's interested in policing. Is it possible to provide the training for that level of need in a police force, or are we really talking about something entirely different?
I want to make sure I understand your question, and it's really around how we train officers to respond to high frequency incidents that feel, that there's a real safety issue there versus those that are in social need. And can we do both? And what does that look like if we don't do both? So you're shaking your head, so I'm gonna say that's it. So part of what we're also talking about is policing culture. So you have to account for the culture as well.
Correct.
And so one of the things that you want to think about is, what are you asking your officers to do and to be?
Right.
You have to make that decision. What do you want their role to be? And so historically what we've done in policing is that we have usually a core basic training that we do, but we also end up training to a response of something. And I'll give you an example. One of the things, of course, with the pandemic is social distancing. Why someone would think that someone with a gun out in the community to enforce social distancing is a good idea is problematic. Cops will tell you that. I'll tell you that.
Yep.
Most people will tell you that. And it's that kind of decision making that we have to think about, is what is the role you want police to play here? If you want them to solely focus on violent crime and other things that need to happen for higher safety needs, then that's a different type of training.
Correct.
And this is not saying that police should be professional, know how to communicate, be courteous. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, what are you asking that role to be? One of the things that's happening nationally in this conversation, and I think you know this, and the example that everyone is holding up, which is true here but in other spaces as well, is co-response models.
Yes.
So if you have someone in mental health crisis, you have a clinician and you have an officer showing up and trying to resolve that issue. Again, I'm not saying that's a bad model or a bad process. For some in the community, that's not the answer. The answer is, why isn't there an investment in mental health? And why do we have to get to a point where we need an officer showing up at the door? That's what we're talking about. And so the questions that have to be asked, is that appropriate role? It absolutely could be for harm reduction while we're trying to figure out what the other side looks like, right? So we're going to get there. We're going towards the ideal. So that absolutely may work. The CIT training is excellent. I took it myself. It is absolutely excellent. But the question is that what you want them to do? If it is not, then you have to make decisions around, well, whose role is it, and what does the system look like that may be failing? And what do you have to do to make that system robust and to be able to answer that need and allow the peace officers to focus on what you want them to focus on? Trying to be, jack of all trades, master of none is not a way to police or to provide public safety. And so when you think about those particular pieces, and let's just say, and we'll just follow this through our logical conclusion, let's say that we don't have officers showing up to folks in crisis, that we do want clinicians to go there, and we want to have a more robust mental health response. I've spoken to groups of social workers who will tell you, we don't have the capacity to do that. And we don't even really have the capacity. We're not all in alignment about what that role should look like and what the service should be. And so that's why it's important to have these full-throated conversations with everyone as we're thinking through. So to answer your question, if you're going to train, you need to know what you're training and who you're training and why you're training them. If you want them to fill in a gap, which officers often do, then you begin to pile additional things on top of them that really have nothing to do with the core functions of the job. The number one thing you have to do before you determine what your training is going to be, what is the core function of the jobs you're asking them to do? When you do that, then you can begin to parse out what's the behavior you're looking for. How do you want them to be able to engage? How should they show up? And then you can begin to do the curriculum for the academy around those very concrete job descriptions, job responsibilities, and you can make that shift. But right now, the way it is happening and the way it's happened up until late is that when you have a space to fill and you've got a system like 911 and 311, that's the group that usually ends up going, and it's not always appropriate for them to go. So I hope I answered your question around training.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Councilman Ortega, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Cassie, good to see you. So I know you were around during our summer of violence that we experienced when Lieutenant Whitman was asked to take on a whole unit that was created that really began community policing in Denver in a whole different way than what we had done it. And part of that effort, as you know, it included 3 different communities across our city. Also engaged part of our gang community. So it wasn't just the communities being impacted by some of the gang violence. It actually tried to engage some of the players who were some of the OGs of the different gangs to look at a whole different way of identifying what some of the root causes were and really work towards creating more peace in our communities and get away from, kids killing each other across our city. So I guess my question for you is, as you have had the opportunity to see this from a much broader perspective across different communities around the U.S., how vital is it when we say, let's bring everybody to the table, that those folks who are creating part of the havoc become part of the conversation?
Absolutely. They absolutely have to be. And so what we didn't know then, I would say in Denver, and thank you for raising that, because this is not the first time you've been in this particular space. It feels it's definitely more intense than that first go round of the 90s. But what we were really trying to get into then, what is really important now, is it's one concept called focused deterrence. And that is bringing folks in who and most cities will tell you this, there's a small percentage of people who are really responsible for violent crime. And it is really bringing those folks in and doing a holistic approach to providing options, training, education, whatever you need, family support, but really leveraging, and we call it really pulling levers, really leveraging a way to holistically bring folks in and say, we've got the services you need. We want to help you take advantage of those. But also at the end of that is if that choice is made not to hopefully make that shift, then there are also more punitive things that you can do. But the focus is really on deterring them away from that. And that's an investment in folks that we often do not make. So reentry becomes important, and folks who are formerly incarcerated become important in that conversation. Equally, when we talk about, all voices, and, I'll say this a couple times, one of the areas where people really struggle is having cops at the table here. And they also have to be a part of that conversation. Now, timing and when they come into the conversation is one thing, but, again, Councilwoman Ortega, when you say, everybody, I mean everybody who wants to participate, everybody who you can reach and get input from, it is important. It is important that what we don't do is end up defining community is and is not. You have to be very careful with that. You have some folks who don't really apply the traditional means of neighborhood and community the way I know I was raised to do it, and you have to be really mindful of that. But yes, everybody's got to be in on that conversation. And if you remember, when we started doing that community policing work and the pushback we got from the community policing work in starting that work, the other thing that we also have to talk about when we want to look at how do we begin to make this change is internal resistance to the change. So change management is going to be equally as important. And again, it doesn't mean that folks, don't have the skill set or the capacity, but how this is, rolled out, trained, discussed, how much input is put in is going to be equally important. And when I say resistance, it's not just the police department. I'm talking about other city agencies that are used to operating a certain way, and this is the way that we've done it, and I don't know why we're moving this way. So it's employee, and I use that as a broad term, employee resistance. Those are other things that you have to manage as well. But as far as all voices at the table, all voices have to be at the table. In any way you can get that done.
One very last quick question, and it's how much as part of the conversation do you think it's important to acknowledge changes that have taken place within, for example, the police department that has really moved the needle? And it's not just the police department. I mean, like our DAs, the role of our DA in terms of who gets charged. As you recall, in the past domestic violence calls, it wasn't always that somebody was removed from the situation. And over time, lots of things have happened working towards making policy changes. And so how much do you think that is an important part of the conversation to show that we haven't just been sitting around not addressing these issues? We have continued to move the needle. And does that mean that we're fine where we're at? No, absolutely not. But so I just wanted to get your thoughts about that.
And that's a really important question because we hear that a lot. So it's important to acknowledge the changes that have been made, and where people are getting stuck is that they keep going back to that. And what the community is saying right now is that incrementalism is not enough, that something has to happen where it feels different and it looks different, and the engagement with some portions of the community is different. I think it's important that you acknowledge that, but what I've seen, the way that it's acknowledged is you keep going back to it. It's like, well, we did this. That's and you're not listening if you're doing that, right? So there is an acknowledgement and typically an acceptance around what we see around the community. But what the community is saying is that's not enough. That's not enough. And the part of the tension that you're hearing across the country is that you have folks that are working in this space, and chiefs and everyone else who are doing just that. Well, we've made reforms, we've made changes, and that's said, listed, understood. But that does not sort of go over the voices of those who are saying that's not enough. That's not, we need something different here, and it needs to feel different. So it's important to say it, but it's important not to get stuck on that as the only thing to show, right? To keep going back to that. But it is important because there is a lot of work that's been done. The problem is that the patience for incrementalism is really starting to dissolve. And so you really have to think about, what else do we do? But yes, you should lift up what you've done, but you also have to ask yourself, is what you've done solve the issue that it was originally designed to do? That's the other thing we have to ask ourselves. And do we need to start measuring what we've done to make sure it is acting in the way? But yes, you should mention that.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Councilman Flynn, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Kesey, thank you. And to follow up on Councilwoman Ortega's question, does there exist, if you're aware, a rigorous, reliable, quantifiable, and measurable way to triage the current demands on police, the 911 calls, the calls for service, in a way that would allow us to divert safely those that can be diverted to other resources and other responses from those that genuinely need to have a police response. We look at an enormous number of calls for service in this city, as you well know, and my concern is that that I don't know that we yet have a reliable way to separate those out.
Yeah, there is. There's a couple of we call them roadmaps that you can follow. I'll send that to you. One of the roadmap resides on the policing-equity.org, and there are initial steps because you have to be very careful when you're doing analysis around 911 and 311 to get demand, because you also want to know what outcomes, and so you also have to know how those things are going into the system, right, and what are those codes. But there are ways in which you begin to do, and we call it. It's really your first cut at the data, right? It's the first piece. Tell us what the demand is. Why are people calling 911? Why are they calling 311? And you'll be able to begin to look at what's maybe out of alignment. But it's a very initial step. There's still a lot of work that has to be done to drill down in each of those buckets of work to see what's going on. But there are a couple models, and I can definitely through the president send those things to you so you can share those out and you can just sort of look through them and see if those may be able to answer your question.
That would be fantastic. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you, Councilman. Dr. Kesey, the floor is back to you.
Right, and thank you for that round of very provocative questions. The next one that is on my list that's sent to me is how can Denver curb the disconnect between law enforcement policies and implementation? So, for example, when compared to PERS best practices and PERF's Police Executive Research Foundation that a lot of major city chiefs rely upon for research. When compared to PERS best practices for use of force policies, Denver is very strong. However, the city
You're frozen, Doc.
use of force complaints made by citizens against law enforcement. How about now? Can you hear me?
Yes, you're back.
Can you hear me okay? Okay, yeah. Perfect. All right. So let me take the first part of the question first, and that is how do you curb the disconnect between policy and implementation? Well, I think most of us know from a policy perspective is that the policy's got to be clear. And the policy needs to be designed in a way in which it can account for what you're trying to solve. And that means when you're doing implementations, or whether you're training officers or you're training community on specific policies, that you also measure whether or not those things are being utilized in the right way or they're being rolled out in the right way. And you have to make sure that they're consistent with it. So it's not just we've got a new policy, we're going to train you on it, and we check that box and we move on. You want to make sure again that you're looking at whether or not it's having the effect. That's different than what you're seeing in regards to continued complaints of use of force, because now we're talking about accountability of that particular policy, and we're talking about how do we make sure that we enforce the accountability around that, right? So that means that supervisors, sergeants on the street, when they see it, they need to be calling it and they need to be, correcting that behavior. Or if it's an IA case, you need to be recognizing patterns around those things and doing the discipline in a way that's timely. So you want to make sure that that you don't have that disconnect between the policy and implementation, but it's also about the accountability around policy. You can't just put policies out there and then think that's going to be enough. That was the concern of a lot of the state legislation we saw coming forward, is that you've got to really pull those to their logical conclusions about what are you trying to solve for and how are you going to actually be able to tell if the policy worked. So you're talking about one, strong policy, two, the implementation and rollout. Everybody understands what it is, what it's solving for, the data to collect to make sure it works. But then the other part, the stronger part of that is the accountability, to make sure that people are doing what that policy is said you should be doing, and that you have to hold them accountable. And not only do you hold them accountable, that correction of behavior, however you want to do it, it's got to be swift. You can't be trying to do an investigation and 3 years later you don't have a response to that, because at that point that's not even effective. And so really it's those sort of component pieces together that we're going to have to look at to make sure that you're getting what you need out of those policies. And again, you have to check them regularly. A lot of times I can tell you, in most police organizations, there's policies that are created and they're usually named after somebody because something went wrong. And that doesn't necessarily mean that policy is what was needed, more so than that person needs to be held accountable. And so just make sure that we have those things in alignment. So so I'm going to stop there. Questions in regards to that particular question?
I think you're free to move forward, Doctor.
Sounds good. All right. So my next one, let's see here. My next one is around community and how is community engaging and what all of the things that are going on. We talk about defund, reimagine, abolishment. What has to happen in that space for community? And so there's probably about 5 things that are happening nationally that a lot of counties and a lot of cities are doing. And first thing is, it's a leadership moment. Most of them acknowledge the leadership moment, and we also acknowledge that we have some leaders that are not equipped for this moment. And that has been, really shows up in really different spaces in different ways, but this is a leadership moment. And part of the leadership moment is, what are you trying to solve for? What is it we are trying to correct or reimagine? And there has to be a really good sort of I always say there's got to be not just a shared language and shared understanding about what that is. There has to be some sort of consensus around that is the right thing. If it is not, then you also have to begin to address what it is not. And you have to get those things in alignment in order to begin to do some of that reimagination work. And these are steps. These are not things that are going to be done in 6 months. They're not going to be done in my next retirement. They may hopefully all won't be completed by then because we didn't get here in that sort of pace and time to think that you can resolve those. You also need to make sure that you are putting enough sort of what I consider space to do the work. We have some cities where they've given their communities and other officials 90 days to create a plan. That tells me where your priorities are in regards to really wanting to get to the issues if you're only giving them 90 days to come up with something to respond to something that's been, historical. And so definitely this is a leadership moment. The other thing is resources. We're asking the community to not only be centered in this work and to direct this work, and they can't do it without resources. We have city and county folks that are providing facilitators or paying community members to be facilitators, providing data, sort of centralizing a data hub where if they want to know about calls for service, if they want to know about, how many folks are going through social services, there's data hubs that they can go and get that information and begin to formulate what they want and need. And also going to a place where you can identify what's already being levied in the community. A lot of times what happens is we have folks who want to own actually processes that belong to the community. And so we often don't feel that folks are going to do it the way we want to do it, or it might not look the way I want to do it. That's not what we're talking about here. We're asking community to have a voice and a say and a direction in their safety. That means that's what has to happen. And so they're going to need support around that. We have cities and counties that are doing that work. They provide framework so that way that we know what things need to be brought up and discussed and walked through that will go into a larger decision-making sort of a mechanism. But there is a framework that's often offered up as well about here are the things that you need to consider. You can't do this work. We have one state, you can't do this work without the input of police, or there's an order in which you do these things. And so you really have to begin to not just provide resources, but provide a framework for what you're asking people to do. The other part of this that's happening throughout the country is guidance and coordination. Someone has got to own this and make sure that it is done in not in a neutral space, by neutral parties where folks agree that these are the right people or person to do that work. And so that work has to be coordinated by one or two or three or a group of people, or whomever you have, where people know that information is coming in. They have confidence that whatever they're bringing in is not being altered or moved around or reinterpreted, that you can let those things live in places where people can look at it and read it, that there's true transparency around all of the work that's trying to be done here. And then, of course, Councilwoman Ortega brought this up. All voices have got to be at the table on this. This is not, we keep you out, let us do this. This timing thing is what we're finding across the country, that the community needs time, one, to grieve and to get through that process, and to also begin to figure out what groups, coalitions, or individuals need to be, lifted up, activated to make sure that you can have folks at the table who can bring those different perspectives and those different needs. And then probably the most important thing that needs to happen, and this process or other cities as well, and we talked about this. There needs to be a foundation of what governance is. How does that budget work? When do you start making budget decisions? When will, if we want this, when will that money get there? When will that investment be there? And really having practical, real, time, reality-driven sort of conversations about how long does it take if you're not going to fund this to get this money here, and if you send it over here, who's receiving it? Who's ready for it? Who also has the capacity built out to be able to begin to help and to off-lift whatever you're going to move over there. Because what you don't want to do is take it from the police and then just have it hanging there, or to give it to a group of people who are not ready and are not even resourced up to begin to accept things. The last thing I will say in this work is this has got to be truly on-the-ground, community-driven. That means that each community, each neighborhood may have a different model or ask for what they're asking. This is new space. There is no real good template about what does it really look like. There is we are not about best practices. We're about evidence-based. People will tell you they've been practiced on enough. Give us something that we know that works, that's informed by community, that we can go ahead and turn around and say, we want to try this. And then again, if it does not work, be ready to make that shift. And you have to be flexible. You have to be able to move and turn and almost on a dime. And sometimes government just doesn't work that way. And so you have to be prepared for that. But I would say probably most important for me out of this is you've got to do all you can to get all voices at the table. Well, even those who are formerly incarcerated, people that you don't agree with, whether it's abolishment or defund, everybody's got to be at the table. Everybody's voice is got to be heard. And you got to do that the best way that you can.
Yes.
Recognizing that you're not going to get everybody. And understand and solve and move for that. So I'll stop there for questions, comments.
I'm going to speak quickly to answer that question. It does not matter where you are. You can advocate everywhere. Yes. Reach out to me directly. I'll get you involved.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Kesey, one of the issues that is a critical part of the conversation is how you get everybody initially at the table to agree. Number one, to leave weapons at the door, leave egos at the door, and be working towards that common goal of identifying, what people want to work on and that they're committed to moving forward together. So how do you build that initial
that felt like a dig at Candy.
Foundation of trust, because that's one of the disconnects that exist, right? And if we create that foundation of trust to work together towards whatever that agreed outcome is, and again, as you're saying, it's going to be different for different communities. And I know we found that during the Weed and Seed days. What existed in the west side and the north side was different from the east side. I mean, they were all different communities, and it took engagement of people in those respective communities where that violence was happening to come together and to identify what some of the root causes were. And, some of that involved, lack of recreation facilities for our youth. It involved a whole bunch of other things around poverty and a lot of that stuff. But I guess just identifying how we get to that sort of agreement that we're going to trust that we're here to work together towards this common, whatever it is that we get to or we agree to.
I am
and thank you for raising that question. Process. Folks aren't going to just sort of give up at the door what they truly believe in to come to the table. And it's a process. But part of that process, though, to get people to the table is you got to listen. You have to listen to what it is the ask is or the issues are. And you also have to give time for that to play out. Because in order to have trust in someone, you have to trust that what you're going to do is going to happen in the way in which you say it's going to happen, and it's going to feel that way.
Gotta
and
listen.
I think you know this, and even as a woman of color, I can tell you there's folks in the community that don't even want to have this conversation because it truly feels as if we're repeating ourselves, and we've been here before, and you say you're going to do this, and it doesn't feel like this. And so really, this is back again in a space where sometimes it's uncomfortable and we don't want people in the room that, are passionate about those things, but it's a process, Councilwoman. I think you know that. I mean, even in the Wednesday days, you yourself had people in those meetings that were not happy, period. And so, but it's a process. But what we didn't do in that process is discount anyone's voice. And just because we did not agree, we didn't discount it. We tried to figure out a way that we can incorporate the things that are being asked. And then in some cases, we agree to disagree. And that's the reality. You agree to disagree. And you may not get everybody on board, and you may not get everybody to say, yeah, this is where we should move. You have to respect that. And for some people, that's really hard. And I can tell you, for control freaks like us cops, it's really hard to want to tell somebody, let somebody go do this, or just absolutely not even be in the space right now. Because everybody sort of wants to get through this moment, and this moment is not meant to be comfortable. This is what change feels like, and unfortunately, some of this is violent. And so one of the things that we have to think about is rethink how we want people to show up. Because some of the work that we're doing, and I noticed this only because I'm old and I'm a grandmother now, some of it is really through the traditional lens of how we used to do that work. And that is not necessarily the case anymore. And we're going to have to really learn how to do approaches in multiple ways. You're going to get folks come to the table and say, I'm ready. We've got those,
Right.
Love them too. But you also have to be prepared that you may not have everybody there, and there may be counter to that. And so you have to manage through that. And that's the hard part. Everybody's not always going to be there. Folks who want to be there will be there. I'm still seeing where we don't have young folks at the table. I'm watching all these processes go. And there are no young people who are impacted most by this at the table. There is still a generational perspective about whether or not the voice is valid. And we have to get away from those things. And I think that's what you're seeing right now. This issue runs along generational lines very differently.
That's right.
And for the folks who are doing this work and doing this bridge work, you've got to understand those approaches have to be respected in a way in which you can get those voices to the table. So there's moments when it's very hard for me. But I also know that in order for us to have everybody at the table, I have to learn that this is the process and not everybody's going to be in love with this. And so we have to work through that.
So do you agree that part of the process is allowing people to just initially just vent about, and part of it's how you identify what the issues are, right? I mean, people come to the table passionately about what they feel, and once you let people get past that and everybody starts focusing on what are the issues and then begin to get to what the solutions are, it's part of people feeling that they've been heard. Do you agree with that?
Well, there's a process, that's correct. But what you have to be careful on is putting your time frame on how long you're going to allow somebody to feel the way that they feel.
Yep.
And that's what we're talking about here, right? We want you to get over this so we can get to the table and get to work. That's us. That's me, being impatient, really wanting to get this resolved. Yeah. It's a process, and it is a process. And so what you can't do is just that. It's like, oh my God, get over it already. It's been 6 months. It's been 9 months. That's not what we're talking about. There's always a reason behind the passion. You and I both know this. And you know how many meetings that we have sat in where people vented. And that is part of that process. It is also part of the process how you react to that, or how you help manage through that, or what resources you put around that. But if you start putting time frames and say that's enough,
that's right, Katrina.
I can tell you, it's in my experience, it just gets ratcheted up even more because you're ignoring it. You're not doing what's being asked of you, and that is, I need you to hear me and acknowledge what I'm saying, and then at some point I may be ready to come to the table. And this is different than just flat out not wanting a meeting to go forward. That's very different. But you cannot tell folks you got 2 days to get over this so we can go to work. That process is a process, and so there are multiple ways you're going to have to come at this work anyway. Not everybody's going to want to be in a room. Not everybody is going to want to be on Zoom. And you're going to have some people, if you do activist work and you're on the ground, you have some people who can't even be in the same Zoom space together. And you need to understand those nuances of who's doing what, who's passionate about what, and then you begin to bring people in and out of that space and then work with people, and eventually you do get to some common ground, but it's going to take time. It is just going to take time, especially now. You're welcome.
Back to you, Doctor.
All right. So my other thing is just some ground setting for you all. Across the country, And I was on a call a couple of days ago with a very large, portion of the military. And across the country, one of the things that's become really apparent, not just from community, but from folks who work in this space, is that there has not been what I consider to be a healing plan. And that means folks are traumatized, historically trauma, currently being traumatized, currently in trauma, and this includes police as well. And part of that conversation really needs to be around how are we providing neutral space or space for people to express, Councilman Ortega, whether it's vent or whatever you want to say, there's a health reason for those things, but how are we providing neutral spaces for those things to happen for our employees, for our folks who do the outward facing work, come to work, have to put on a uniform or have to be somewhere to provide service and are feeling some kind of way about what's going on. And we're finding that those things are not being attended to as well. What we have is we have leadership trying to solve up here, but in the meantime, everybody down here is going through something. And so a lot of what needs to be happening, some of this work is simultaneous work, but a lot of this is about activating people who can help you manage this work. A big part of what's happening right now is with whether it's chiefs, whether it's community members, council folks, is really trying to figure out how do you let people begin to express how they feel about certain things and what they're going to do. This is a part of that process, right? How do you allow employees to talk about this? One of the biggest movements we have seen at CPE is the call from employers about the unrest happening inside organizations, because those issues are also being experienced inside an organization. And there's got to be alignment in that work. And so one of the things that we ask people to think about as you're putting together, strategic plans or whatever you're going to do to reimagine, that there's got to be a health plan component to this. There's got to be a way to help people through trauma. There's got to be a way for people to begin to heal. And all of those things have to be accounted for. And that's a big gap that we're seeing, that work is not there. And those services should be pushed down as far as they can out into the community. So there should be community places where people can go, whether it's breath work, whether it's mental health work, where they can go and don't have to come all the way across town to get that work. So you also need to think about how are you going to begin to do the work of healing and health, because that's what's happening here as well. You have people who have historically have been, or I would say, overly continually compounded trauma. And how are we going to start managing and beginning to help people through those spaces as well? So when you think about this work, you really have to step back as opposed to thinking of what can we get done, what can we hold up and say that we've done, and acknowledge and recognize that all of this is a process. All of it is interconnected. You're going to have to engage lots of people to help get the work. It's got to be coordinated. And you also have to be able to tell community and even employees, what's happening, what's going to happen at the end of this. Who's making the final decision? How are those decisions going to be made? Who's involved? Who participates? How do you make it public? So there's all of those things in addition to what we've sort of talked about that you also want to make sure that you have those threads running through, including communication. How are you talking about what we're doing, not doing, where's it posted? What are you all doing in your respective districts? What does that look like? And then allow for people to really read and look and investigate for themselves what's going on. But they will also then decide whether or not they want to be a part of whatever this is going to be. So that's all that was asked of me. So I'm open for more questions if you have them.
Sure. Well, I'll jump in here. Thank you, Doctor, for your thoughts thus far. So you asked at the very beginning, what is the ask from the community? We need to identify that. And a lot of this question that I'll ask you, I think, is implied in much of what you've spoken about. But I think the big, the elephant in the room is how do we stop unwarranted killings of men and women of color by police officers? I think that's the big ask at the top of all this. And is it training? Is it hiring? Do we disarm portions of our police forces? How would you directly look at that? How would you frame that discussion?
I would frame it just the way you just did, with a series of questions. What are we trying to solve for? And if it's the ceiling of unarmed Black men and women, then you have to ask yourself, all what you just said, is it training? Is it who we're bringing on? I go back to my earlier comment about what are you asking police to do and to be? And so all of those questions are ones that you would explore, and you have to do that. And this is why it's not anything you can do overnight, and you can't just pull that string and or as I told people, you can't turn off the lights one day and turn them on and hope you have something completely different. You have to disentangle a lot of different things to make things move around, but you have to begin to ask and answer your questions, and that's where you start. And usually when you do that, you try to see if there's anyone else that are, working on those models. And even the work in Minneapolis is they talk about, dismantling, defunding the police. That's in itself is a process, because you have to begin to ask and answer those questions you just said. If we're going to do this, what's in its place, or is there anything in its place? And if not, how do we account for people who need help? What do we do there? So those are questions that you have to actually explore. And what you don't want to do, they're important questions, but you really have to explore that. But you also have to have the exploration of those questions out into the public sphere as well, right? Those are legitimate questions. And I'll give you an example. In one of the cities, all the cities we work with are experiencing high rates of crime. And one of the cities is very much a defund city. I understand all of that. And so, but in this process, the question that I always raise and that others raise, so when we begin to do this work and while we're doing this process, who responds to the person that's in need? If it's a domestic, if it's a homicide, if it's child abuse, who is the appropriate group, people, persons, team, community group to respond to those needs? Because those needs don't stop, and everybody has different levels of need and different levels of safety. And so you have to also begin to unpack those things and ask the questions. And even the cities that we sit with and community with, that's not an offensive question. That's just one that we need to think about. Think about it, because even when we think about what the response may be, we know we want treatment to feel different than it feels now. But we know the cops are not responsible for that treatment. And so now we're talking about activating another system and needing to look at that. And especially when you're looking at equitable treatment. I mean, we can look at the pandemic and know what's happening. And so it's really about asking the hard questions, posing those questions to community, asking for suggestions or models they may know. A lot of times the community is doing some of this work on the ground already. Models that you can lift up, you can expand, think about differently, but without those voices, you can't answer those questions. You've got to answer them fully, and that's everybody. So I wish there was something I could say to you and say, well, here is the recipe for how to stop. We're all going through the same thing. Everybody throughout the country is going through the same thing. Different levels, different intensity, different starting points, but everybody is trying to get at that specific question.
Sure. Have you seen examples around the country of programs that have been put in place that have leveled the playing field, where the numbers of, we see the statistics of people of color being pulled over on traffic stops as opposed to the white population? The reason I ask this is that we hear a lot that reforms just aren't helping. And I'm wondering, are there programs in place anywhere that are having success at bringing equity into community policing?
When we say level the playing field, that's always a trigger for me, because the playing field is not level, and you gotta understand that. So, but I hear what you're saying, and that is, how do you bring in things that can help reduce the impact and the footprint that we're having on certain spaces? I'll give you an example of one that was really done creatively. Chief Arredondo out of Minneapolis partnered with businesses when vehicles were being pulled over for defective vehicle. That means equipment violations, and something was happening and there was a disparity in his equipment violations. He partnered with service groups like, sort of like Grease Monkey, those kinds of things where you can go, Jiffy Lube, and instead of a ticket, what they give you is a voucher to go get your car fixed. That's your first ticket. Not really a ticket, it's actually a voucher for you to go get the lamp fixed, for you to get the brake lights fixed. their solve. And it's a solve that the community, it's a solve that everybody liked. It wasn't just, you know, the Black community or other communities of color. Why not? Why would you not say, hey, you know, apparently you're having problems keeping this car up, and you don't want to get into, you know, well, now it's the role of the city to do, you know, car maintenance. This is a simple gesture that really indicates that, you know, you may be going through something right now, but here you go, try that, as opposed to ticketing the car and towing it, which gets you nowhere, but gets that person with compounded fees. And so it's really thinking about how do you approach that in a way that helps officers also be able to give something that doesn't have them coming out as a bad person as they're sitting there towing the car, because that's the policy. And so those things have to be in alignment, and you want to make sure they're in alignment. There are lots of creative ways. There are lots of creative ways probably you can get from the community who can ask and answer those questions for you as well. You know, how would you handle X? It goes back to your questions. Ask the questions. Do not hold back on asking questions. Ask the questions of the community. They want to be engaged. They want to answer. They want to provide consistence. So definitely. But there's examples like that throughout the country where people have just done those little things, as opposed to this is just the way we've always done it, right? So it really is, take a look at those processes and those policies that we're asking specifically officers to enforce and uphold. And again, this is separate from violent crime response. This is day-to-day engagement with officers. And so those are other ways that we can build upon that trust, right? Hopefully the experience is a good one and you're at the car window and those things are, the conversation is going well. But you also have to manage, you know, you can have those processes, but when you have officers that are stressed out, officers that, you know, don't know what's going to happen from one day to the next, that impacts even the best of intentions. And you have to be able to account for that.
Great, thank you. I see Councilman Flynn with his hand up. Go ahead, Councilman.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a comment on that. Just thank you so much, Dr. Kesey, for mentioning that. I had seen that program, that the broken taillight issue, in other coverage, and that was certainly one of the items on my list to say that, you know, this is at least one solution here. Most people will never know that their taillight is out unless someone pulls them over, and that's the first time they have to learn of it. It's such an elegant and simple solution. I just wanted to thank you for highlighting that. And that's all I have, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Sure. Another topic, elephant in the room topic that I hear, you know, brought up in these times when we're looking for something to change the paradigm. Is anybody, to your knowledge, in the U.S. Looking thus far seriously at any degree of disarming the police?
It's a topic that's on the table. There hasn't been anyone yet that has taken the initial step to do that. And it's not necessarily, you know, how do we look at disarming or whether or not an armed presence is appropriate, right? So it's really how you look at what you're trying to do. There's lots of folks that are having the conversation around disarming officers. But again, I'm going to go back. What are you asking people to do? What is their role? Right? And so if you have people that are doing a different type of job and providing a different type of public service, the question is, does that position require you to have a weapon? And so those are the things you have to ask yourself and answer them. And if you're saying yes more than no, then you need to really go back and say, okay, there's got to be something else underlying here that's happening. And so really it is asking those questions in the right way. It's not, do we just disarm the police? It's like, does it require a presence with a weapon? Right. And if not, who should be doing this work? And really diving into it, as you mentioned earlier, and I think it was Councilman Flynn that said, how do you get into the data? How do you get into what's being asked of officers to respond to? How do you get into that and figure that out? I mean, so there's ways. It's going to take time, but it's a robust conversation. What's appropriate for someone to show up? And the cops would like that answered as well. What is it you want me to show up to and not do, not be? And we can be that. But we need to know what that's going to be. It can't change every day. Yeah, if this is the group that does this, that's what they do. And you have to keep the fidelity of that. Because originally policing was not designed and looking the way that it looks now anyway. And so it has turned into something that I think most of us who've been on for a while really never thought was the space we should be in. But, you know, as I always tell people, cops don't make policy. They don't make policy.
Great. Thank you. I've got Council President Gilmore up.
Thank you, Councilman, and thank you, Dr. Kesey, for sharing your wealth of knowledge and information with us. And wanted to understand from you a little bit more. I love the question framing. What are the questions that you're trying to answer, and then working out from there. And I guess in your experience, working with maybe police unions or officers, and really having them help as well. What are the questions that they need to answer for their own ranks around accountability? But then also, we're kind of in that weird space right now that we don't have the money within the city budget to launch a brand new initiative. We don't have that luxury. But with the police force and with those authorized numbers and the structure that we have, I've talked to a lot of police officers, and they've got great ideas, and they're like, yeah, we probably shouldn't be the ones going out to XYZ calls. And so I guess working with what we have currently, are there cities or police departments that are talking about innovative ways to do that? Because it kind of feels like we don't have that luxury of launching something brand new, and working with what we have. We know that reform hasn't gotten us to the place that we all desire to be. And so I guess, how are you seeing those conversations happen where maybe some police officers aren't armed with a weapon, with a gun, or are deployed in different ways? And I guess I don't even know really if there's even an appetite for that conversation with the police. And so would just love to get your perspective.
Thank you for that question. And so I'm going to go back to, I think, what we've all been mentioning earlier, is that everybody's voice has got to be in on this. Right? So you do want to hear from police. And I don't think community necessarily wants you not to. It's really the priority of which you do that, and making sure that the community voices don't get overrun. And I think that's the important piece. But let's go back to, how do we do this with police? And I will tell you, nationally, even with unions, and I know, folks can feel whatever kind of ways they want to feel with unions, but they also have to be at the table, because even the position of unions is starting to shift. There's lots of questions around union, whether or not they represent the entire organization. And I say this as a person of color. Those questions come up, right? So if you are doing this type of work, you say you're representing all of us, and yet, it doesn't feel that way. I look at the board, I look at whomever, it doesn't feel that way. And those are the conversations that are happening across the country. Doesn't make it bad, doesn't make it, that's just what's happening. But you have to have that conversation as well. And equally will community usually come up with great ideas and approaches they want. Cops will tell you what they don't want to do. They're pretty quick. We'll tell you in a heartbeat, why are we doing this? Why are we the ones that have to go in and take care of this particular issue? Why can't this person go? Or why doesn't this group show up? So they often do have that particular, can offer up a solution, and it is offering up a solution. Where we have seen the struggle has been with chiefs being able to have that conversation. And when you have that conversation, much like in community, you're going to trigger a lot of things. And so you have to be prepared for the things that you're going to trigger. And a lot of that has to do with how they feel about what's happening in this moment right now. Those conversations haven't been had. Do they understand what's going on in this moment? They certainly have perspectives about what's happening in this moment. And so same thing that we're reporting community to do in regards to where are you with this, and it feels very personal. You got to give them that same space. And I've never known cop to not tell you what they think and what they think should happen. And it's really a way of making sure that whatever you do, you facilitate that conversation. Whether it's a survey, you can do a survey. You can make sure that when you are asking the questions, you frame the questions where you can get a response. That's different than providing a neutral space for them to be able to say, I'm not good with this. You hear a lot of conversation in the media right now about early retirements, high frequency of retirement. I get that. Most of us do. We get it. But we also know that sometimes it's not about what's going on. Sometimes it's just time for me to go, and I can go. And you're going to have a few that say, I don't like the moment we're in right now, which is understandable. It's a personal decision to retire. But it's really one in which you're doing the exact same thing. You're going to have to figure out, what does that space look like where they feel safe to do that, where they can offer up their opinions and not get pushed back or feel or fear that someone's going to find out and disagree, and you're going to have this internal piece going on. So there are ways to do that. We have cities, we have departments who are doing that. We spend a lot of time with chiefs, because a lot of times the leaders themselves are not ready for that conversation, and getting them prepared for that and what that looks like. Because if you want a leader that's able to have that conversation internally, because you want the same leader to be able to sit in community and be able to listen, not defend, but listen, and then begin to work towards what do you need to work towards. So there's internal work that I know is happening at the police department, but there's also things that I don't think have been really intentional about getting that information out about what do you see, how do you see that. That's separate from behavior, right? Behavior on the street. You're asking about, what do you think of this moment in time? What should you be doing? What should you not be doing? Ask them the question, should you be armed or not armed? You're going to get multiple responses depending on what it is and what you're asking them to do. But you have to make decisions about what do you want. Do you want public safety? And if you do, what does that look like? What does that mean? As soon as you figure that out, then you can begin to talk about those broader, more intricate questions around arm, disarm, on foot, on bike, in car. Do you need cars? Do you need to change uniforms? I mean, those are national things that are coming up. And so I think, but all of those things cost money. And so you have to think about, if you're changing uniforms, changing cars, putting people on foot, whatever, you have to really think about, how do you want to do this? But I appreciate asking, how do you lift up those voices? And you can do that. There's a way to do that.
Thank you so much for that. And the survey idea of, really asking officers, asking folks, what do you want to do? What don't you want to do? What are the suggestions? And is that survey work? And I know that there's a lot of behind the scenes and shaping the intentionality and what are those questions, but would you recommend that some sort of department-wide survey be happening on an annual basis, or at different points in time, or what's the best process to do that, so we as council can also, and I think for the community, that transparency of understanding, I mean, these are the officers that are first line for many people for a variety of reasons: mental health, substance abuse, family issues, etc. They're going to call 911, and it seems remiss of us not to be looking at that survey to gather that information to help inform this community conversation, because I'm really hearing it only from the community side and then from the appointees of the Department of Safety, etc., the chief, but not from the rank and file folks.
That's right. And so I would, let's back up a little bit about frequency. It's going to depend on what the ask is, right? So you're going to want to ask over a series of time. If you're getting initial thoughts so you can help inform some of the work, that's one thing, as opposed to implementing something new with them and then going back to see if it's working. So you'll do a time series of those things. Once that work is done, we'll do an annual survey, right? So it starts to give you a baseline. You can go back and see what's changed, what's changing or not changing, and you can go from there. My suggestion when you do surveying of officers is that you not have that survey be administered by the city. You pick a third-party independent person who can pull that information and analyze it and provide that to the public without worrying about whether or not, is it legit or not. So and especially for officers, because the last thing you want to do is put your information in there and they know who you are. Right. So for me, it was fairly easy. At one point, if I put black female lieutenant, there was only one. So it wasn't that hard to say it was Tracy. And so you really want to be careful about how you ask that information, but you want to ask maybe tenure, gender, race, and ranks sometimes. And those are things you can work out with whomever you find to help you do that survey. But my recommendation would be go to an outside party. There's other communities that do survey work. We've got so many universities surrounding us there. That would get in on that work, but you want to also, I would also say that you really would want to make sure that when you design that you design that with questions from the community as well. So you can ask and have those answered, because there are some questions communities asking that you may not be able to answer, but the cops can't give them a perspective on it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any hands in the queue. I'm just thinking this is as much for my colleagues as for Dr. Kesey. Where you were talking about earlier, Doctor, about the co-responders program, and I'm thinking about, there's probably times where we've got our co-responders program that sends out a social services professional along with a police officer. Now we have the new STARS program that no cops are involved. And how do we ensure when those calls come in that the right team is going to the right call? And I'm also thinking as well about, I know some cities are working with shifting traffic enforcement away from sworn officers. And again, reading sworn officers talking about how traffic stops can be some of the most dangerous calls they make. And I'm just thinking, colleagues, I think it might be an interesting presentation to hear from our 911 department on how they do go about triaging those calls.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is absolutely appropriate. And the other thing that you want to look at is, what does the national data tell you about officers and injuries? LEOCA, the law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty work, will give you the national numbers about how officers are injured or killed. So you can also look at that as well and see how you may be able to make adjustments. There's lots of things you can begin to look at once you sort of do your first initial look at 911. But I think the most important thing is what you're doing now. You need to just ask the questions, right? Bring in the 911 folks from the Combined Communications Center and say, okay, talk to us about how you triage. What does it look like? What is the officer's role in closing out a call? They have to give a code so they know that this call has been, cleared in a way in which it's been handled. Understand what the codes mean. How do you activate certain things through policing? Because that's the other thing. I think a lot of people forget that oftentimes it's through police where you get your additional services. And so you have to ask yourself, is that the appropriate path to come through to get what you need? So, there's multiple ways in which you can look at it and actually sort of start to look and sort of disentangle. Because that's really what you're doing, is you're disentangling, and it'll also allow you to look at other city services and see where you need to begin to look there and figure out what's happening, right? So there may be something happening, but there's capacity or it's lack of capacity, or you don't have enough invested there, where you can start to shift and start to look at all the other government systems that interact with policing.
Great. Councilwoman Gilmore, you're back up.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. This conversation around 911 is very interesting. And Dr. Kesey, we have a brand new 911 call center in Montbello, right off of 45th. And so we're really blessed and happy to have the 911 call center in the district, and it's a one-stop shop for fire, other responses, state of the art. And something that we were talking about that the community brought up was, 911 is internationally known. If you are in crisis, your brain goes into autopilot and you're going to dial 911. And we were talking about with the community, what would it look like if you dial 911, but your call doesn't necessarily right away dispatch an officer or a car? There's other dispatching that goes out to those mental health providers, to whoever might be the right folks. And, the pushback was, well, you can call 311, you can call 211. Well, just from a psychological standpoint, that folks are going to call 911. So on the entry point at 911, the communication center, how could we deploy differently to be more responsive to the public health and safety of different communities? And are there good examples? Because right away there was like, oh my God, the software or the retraining of the 911 operators. And so I love your idea, Mr. Chair, to bring in 911 and see what they're doing to maybe address some of this or how they operate. But there are good examples of other cities, Dr. Kesey, that maybe deploy 911 resources in that way.
There's a couple of cities, but I always have to caution folks that some are not as lucky to have combined systems state of the art. There's still really, disconnected fires over here. Some of them might be in the same room, but they do that. There's a few, but I want to go back on something you said a little bit too, because this is important to lift up even more. It is the culture around 911. And one of the things we have to do is change the culture around 911. And whether, we figure out another number or we do something different. I mean, you remember, I certainly remember this with my own daughter and my grandkids. That was the first 3 numbers they learned, was 911. Even when you didn't want them to dial it, they were dialing it. And so it's one of those things where you're trying to, hope that they can figure out a place to get help quickly, but also it itself has morphed into something that was never intended to be. I also, I get concerned when I hear people say, well, that means we're going to have to train them in different ways. Well, this is, again, the question, what is the role? What is it you want them to do? And the triaging is very important when those calls come in, because this is also where we find where police gets weaponized. So when you make that call, it is how are you triaging to ask someone who may be upset or maybe viewing 2 or 3 folks of color outside the window, what is really going on there? That also puts the officers in a position that they often have to begin to now, dance around why are we really here? So I think it's really important that you do have them come and talk about how they do triage. I mean, I'm sure they have a really good system to do that, as well as they have a process for dispatching co-responders. So they're already doing it. And I think the questions that you sort of build up around that to ask are, how do you know when you send one who needs a weapon, who doesn't, or is a weapon needed at all? Do you send the fire department instead? So I think it's really important that you understand how those calls get triaged.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Back to you, Councilwoman Ortega.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dr. Cassie, I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you for taking the time to help us really be more broad in our thinking about how we approach this collaboratively with community, with our police department. And I also wanted to congratulate you on your title of grandparent. I know some of us on the council also enjoy that title and enjoy our grandbabies. So congratulations. Thank you.
Me too. Thank you. They're teens now, so that's a whole different. Then tell me this part in grandparent school. This is a whole different animal right now. It's just amazing. But thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Great. Well, we are about at our time for the day. I see no further hands up. So, Dr. Kesey, I want to once again thank you for many years of service directly to the city and county of Denver. Thank you for the work you're doing now at the Center for Policing Equity. And also thank you so much for giving us your time this morning. A lot of good things to think about and thoughts to carry forward as we continue looking at policing in the city and county of Denver. So with that, seeing no further business, this meeting is adjourned and we will see you all soon. Thank you so much.
Well, there you have it. That was a clown show. At least Denver City Council seems to acknowledge that it's a clown show, as it did 2 weeks ago when it decided to pound on Councilperson Candy Sedabaka. Now, all of this that you saw today was to rebut what she brought to the table. What they were asking over and over and over was anyone else done this successfully? Then why should we be the first? The reason we need to try something is because Black people and brown people are dying at alarming rates. Murder by police is the 6th leading cause of death for Black individuals in America. That statistic is accurate. Go look at Dr. April Alexander's Twitter for the source material. All we want to do, all we're asking for is for City Council to do something, because this current approach of the status quo isn't working. Many things are not working simultaneously, but really using your platform in an entire meeting to beat up on one of your brown councils in the name of unity is particularly ugly. And made my daughter cry. I'm still not over it. So it's part of the reason why I come here. This meeting right here is probably the most important one you can do all week. This committee is where the decisions and the bills are informed, where the council members take in thoughts and listen to ideas about maybe what they should do. And God, it is a privilege. It's an honor to learn about racist cops from people who have to deal with racist cops and academicians like Dr. April Alexander. People like us, are raised to believe, like me, white, privileged, as close to normative as you could possibly be, we're raised to believe that the police are there to protect and to serve. So there's always a part of us that says, well, I don't know, what did they do? Because that's a survival mechanism. This thing that makes me feel safe, and the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, safety's a big one. So if you are telling me that this thing that makes me feel safe does not, in fact, make me or anyone else safe, then I really need you to prove that, because that could topple the hierarchy of needs and totally destabilize my mind. That's called, something that destabilizes your mind that way is called trauma. And that's what happened to me when I usually say violently sexually assaulted, because that's somehow pleasant, more easy on the ears, I guess. But that was when I was 19. And that's when I realized, wow, everything I learned growing up about the cops is absolutely true. They're not here to protect me. They're here to make sure that I am silent, that is what their idea of keeping the peace was. Other communities have been learning this in much more drastic ways. That moment for me was destabilizing. This whole system doesn't work, not just for me, but it doesn't work, period. So that's why I laugh when people are like, what you gonna do when you get raped? I'm like, let me tell you about the 2 times it happened. Civic engagement matters. I know it can be really boring, guys. I do. And I didn't want to talk over the speaker, so I said most of what I had to do here with my cute little pithy comments throughout the city council meeting, paraphrasing the questions as I heard them and the response that she was too polite to give. They basically were like, is anyone else doing anything better? Because if they're not, then what we're doing de facto is not bad. And she was like, well, no. And politely, it was very interesting. I'm a straight shooter. I just say what's in my head. And I don't have a lot of time anymore because I'm old and the stakes are really high. I don't have time anymore to dance around subjects when people are dying. I don't. It's amazing that the city council does. It's amazing that they were going to police Representative Sedebaka the same way the police came at me when I tried to report my trauma a long time ago. And it's incredible that we would be dismissive of the trauma of entire communities in Denver rather than just actually take measures to stop killing Black people. Because if anything we do to kill fewer Black people might make all of us, the rest of us really, unsafe, it would be dangerous to not kill Black people. It would be dangerous to not adjust this system that disproportionately kills Black people. And I need to be really sure that I'm not creating a bigger danger. So we're going to have another working session. We're going to think about it some more. We're going to call in more experts. Oh, that was great. Let's call in 911 next and see if they can triage. Is that like a throuple? I only learned what that word was the other day when I was watching that Netflix show, The Politician. I'm like, I don't want to know anything. So triage is nothing like throuple. Y'all go, if you're old like me and you don't know that word, Google it. I don't want to say it anymore. But that is what kept coming into my head. Like, come on. It is possible to do this well. Just because no one else is doing it well doesn't mean we can't give it a try, period, because we owe it to our constituents. Finally, it was kind of amazing. She was like, well, maybe you should take a survey. And all the council members were like, ooh, survey. Like, Sedebaka didn't do that a couple weeks ago. After they shot it down and said, no one wants to reform, no one wants change in the police, she was like, well, let me prove it to you and send out a survey where it really did say, we want defunding, we want reform, we want change. And then they were like, you got people, we don't know where these people came from, and threw it away. They find ways to invalidate and dismiss anything she brings to the table, even though she absolutely does represent our voices. In this moment that is about Black lives, she pulled a political move, one that I really support, and took direct action to put those bills in the agenda. She never expected them to pass. No one did. The point was making sure the community knew that at least one council person was responding to this cry for change that would result in fewer Black and brown people killed by the police. No one else was responding. She did. And then they decided to beat up on her in a council meeting, the one that made my daughter cry. And then today was another dog and pony show to invalidate everything that she said. But what's kind of amazing was this speaker that they chose reinforced everything Candy Sadabaka said. So that made me really happy. If you have nothing better to do today, I beg you, please go look around for unhoused individuals. They have been scattered like cockroaches throughout the city, now with another completely ridiculous waste of our tax dollars in the form of a sweep. 4 young protesters have been arrested. And by I say young, I mean, I call them kids. They're about easily half my age. I'm old enough and I can say that now convincingly. They are half my age. They are not bad kids. They are engaged. I've seen them. One of these kids is maybe 19 years old, maybe. And I have seen her at every single city council meeting that I've attended this year. All of them. You know, if I were to go back and look through some of the videos, because we record the city council on Channel 8 on Monday nights, I would probably see her sitting in the audience there too, long before I got that subscription box and my daughter was told to find a local trailblazer and to look to city council for local elected officials. That was how I came to this. So if you're sitting there feeling like, gosh, maybe I should do more, because it always becomes about us, right? Like about our deficiencies. But I want you to know this. I wasn't that involved with all this stuff. I'm very cynical about local politics because I think I'm from a tiny town and I think they're all rigged. And I'm very apathetic about it. And now I'm like, there is just no turning back. So if you feel like you're behind, get out of the should. It's shaming to live there. It's shaming to be there. Don't think that way. This is new for me too. It's not like I've always been doing this. I did this for a while and then I stopped. Why? Didn't do me any favors. Didn't win me any popularity contests, and it made life harder for my kids. So I kept my mouth shut for their sake, and now I have to open it again for their sake. Final note. The homeless thing is a big deal. It is a big deal. I know it's COVID and many of you are not leaving your homes. For those of you who are, just take a slow drive around District 7. There are homeless people everywhere, you guys. Everywhere. And I'm not the Pollyanna who's going to tell you that they're all people and that they're totally safe. Not all of them are. They're the unhoused, which in my brain are 2 separate communities. You have the unhoused, who are the people who have been evicted by COVID, who still can sort of fit the confines of society. They've just either through systemic oppression or really bad luck have just not been able to get out from underneath it. And then you have those who no longer fit in society for a variety of really complicated reasons like addiction or mental illness, which I hate using those terms, but it can be very difficult for some to do even the things that we take for granted, paying bills on time, showing up on time, not being in a house, being inside. It can feel a lot like a prison, especially when that prison is your own mind. Ask me how I know. So I tell you that to tell you this, it is not a solution to sweep them out of sight. You are sweeping them onto the Cherry Creek Trail to sleep under a bush, to jump out and surprise me when I go for a run. You are sweeping them into the streets where your kids are going to walk past them if they walk to school like we do to Lincoln Elementary. It's we can't, not now because of COVID, but it's 3 blocks away. We walk there and walk home all the time. This is dangerous. When we don't address societal ills, when we say that if I don't have to see it, then it's fine, we're actually making things worse. And that is exactly what Mayor Hancock has sanctioned. He's arresting protesters for disturbing a sweep right now, instead of taking that money and putting it towards a sustainable solution for the unhoused right now during a pandemic and a period of record evictions, which have in fact increased the homeless issue. And it's not just him, it's Jared Polis too. You both do better, wake up. Anyway, to the rest of us, if you really want to do something nice, you can donate to one of the bail funds. These poor kids are going to need them today. Luckily, Denver has one of the best systems of public defenders in the country. So anyone who gets a public defender is going to be fine. But yeah, donate to their bail because otherwise they're going to have to sit in there and that's not okay. I'm going to put some links in the notes later. But donate to their bail and then go find unhoused somewhere near you or not near you. Who cares? Take them water. It's hot outside. Why are we talking about winter? I heard that yesterday. It made me so angry. We're waiting till winter to do something about the house. Like, I get that cold kills, but heat does too. It really does. So yesterday was 102 degrees when I was driving downtown to Denver Homeless Out Loud's offices. It's just unbelievable. I went through 2 gigantic camelbacks of water while walking around during the day. We need to care more. We need to care more regularly. Anything that we can't cure from a public health perspective, then we need to contain. And sweeps are the opposite of containment. It's the opposite. It's increasing the danger. So that's all I have to say about that. If you have not been outside enough to see the unhoused in your community yet, I encourage you to come walk with me. Let's take a walk with me in the evenings. It's one of my favorite things to do. I like to go for a nice 2-mile walk before I go to bed at night. Not that late, around 8:30, 8 or 8:30, somewhere in there after I get the kids down. Come join me for the walk, and I will show you how big this problem is and how close to your front door it is too. It's not okay. It's not safe for them. It's not safe for us. And the place to start demanding change is city council, because it is literally their job. Yep. I know. Wow. Survey. That is how I feel too, Jordan. That is for sure. Facts. Thank you. Yep. We live in an urban heat sink. It is so hot outside. It is so freaking hot. I know that I have some work to do this afternoon. I wish I could be out there sooner, but I've really been neglecting my work lately to do all of this and to coordinate with jail support to make sure that every person who had been arrested had been identified, their legal name found, and support and family members contacted. Because I'm a mom and that's what I do. And I know what it's like to be in a place where you don't have family nearby and no one would notice if you went missing or cared if you were gone too long. I know what that feels like. And I'm not going to let anyone, especially people who are out there doing good work helping our neighbors, go through that or have that feeling. I'm here and I got your back, while moms does too. Yep. Where are we walking? Come meet me. If you want to take a walk with me this evening, meet me. Here is where I'll put it. 8 p.m. at Logan and Kentucky. That's where it's going to be, 8 p.m. at Logan in Kentucky. We're going to take a walk around Denver District 7, Lucky District 7 as Jolon Clark likes to call it. And I'm going to show you how much my path has changed recently and where I find homeless people regularly. I do ask, these are people. I have never taken photos and I'm not about to start. I'm not going to call out their locations either, but it'd be cool to have people with me to bear witness to these shocking numbers. Used to be when I would see 3 or 4. Now it's up to 22 on a 2-mile walk. So that the numbers shock me, but they're true. All I ask is that if you join me for this, do not take pictures, do not out their location. If anything, we can give them some grocery cards. That's always a nice thing to do. $15 would get them a warm meal from Safeway. And yeah, Safeway's not that close, but these guys are used to walking with everything they own on their backs. Finally, I'll show you a place where people who are living in their cars and where you can drop supplies for them as well. I don't care if this is encouraging them to come into my community, you guys. If that's what it takes to get you to show up to a fucking city council meeting and can push Jolon Clark on this and can push Mayor Hancock on solutions instead of sweeps, I'll invite them all in. Not above it. Think I'm kidding? Try me. Yay, I'm grateful for you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for saying that. I look forward to seeing you guys at 8 p.m. Logan in Kentucky. We'll talk a little bit about how sweeps are not solutions, and we'll do some math, because math is great. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being engaged. For now, please donate to the bail funds. We're going to need them. They're arresting the unhoused and protesters who weren't even protesting. They were just helping the unhoused pack before their stuff could be thrown into a garbage truck. It's disgusting. These are the most vulnerable. They deserve better. You're coached. You're loved. See you tonight.